The Somme Valley in northern France. A once pristine and bucolic landscape, transformed by the First World War into a lifeless moonscape of shell holes and mine craters. July 1st, 1916. 500,000 young, inexperienced, and eager British soldiers would have to cross this desolate field to attack entrenched German forces. It was the first real test for this modern British Army.
World War I in and of itself is the transitional war between pre-modern and truly modern industrial war. And if you want to boil down that transitional moment, it is the Battle of the Somme.
The assault, the British assumed, would be brief, and the enemy battered. They were wrong.
The Germans have a motto in this battle that the British will get to Germany over blood-stained German corpses, that they're going to have to fight for every inch of the way.
In a matter of hours, tens of thousands of soldiers were slaughtered. And at the end of the day, the dead were likened to swaths of cut corn at harvest time.
The Somme really is, I think, the fulcrum of the First World War. Nothing is quite the same after that battle has been fought.
Since the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the British, French, and Russians, lacking coordinated leadership, had struggled to direct their forces against an alliance dominated by Germany. The first 2 years of the war had only led to frustration, stalemate, and limited accomplishment. The German army remained a formidable threat, and a war that most had assumed would be over in a few months had stretched on for years. A new strategy was required, and to that end, in December of 1915, the Allies met to discuss their options.
One of the conclusions that they drew at this meeting was that the Allied armies had been effectively fighting separate wars, and the way to defeat Germany was to fight concerted, concentrated battles at the same time.
The Russians, it was decided, would strike in Austria, while the French and British would mount their attack along the Western Front. That front, composed of lines of heavily armed trenches and barbed wire, ran from the North Sea through Belgium and France to the border of Switzerland, 300 miles long. In northern France, the British and French armies stood side by side along the Somme River. And it was here that the French pressured the British into mounting a joint campaign against the Germans.
The British attack is the subsidiary attack. The British are supposed to lock the Germans into place, while the much larger French army is the army that's supposed to achieve victory.
The French were the senior partner in the alliance, and basically what the French said went. I mean, a contemporary parallel would be look at the role of the United States today. The Americans were the biggest, most powerful force, the biggest, most powerful army. They're the ones who ultimately call the tune. And the French were in a similar situation vis-à-vis the British in 1916.
But only weeks after the Allies devised their strategy, the Germans took the initiative. In a move that both stunned and overwhelmed the French, the Germans launched a massive attack on the town of Verdun, drawing the French away from their commitment at the Somme.
The German goal at Verdun was to bleed the French white. The entirety of the French army is dragged to the meat grinder at Verdun, and their commander is very worried that indeed the Germans may be achieving their goal and the French may be forced to capitulate. He virtually begs the British to do something.
And so, to relieve the French army, the British prepared to attack at the Somme. The British Empire was unrivaled in the early part of the 20th century. With more than 400 million subjects around the world, the British were considered the first superpower. But at the start of the First World War, they had one undeniable weakness.
The British had the world's most powerful navy, but actually an army which was very small by the standards of the French and the Germans and the Russians.
The British Army at the beginning of World War I is, for all intents and purposes, a highly efficient colonial police force. Go back into British military history, the tried and true method of fighting on the continent is don't fight on the continent. Allow the French to do it for you if you're fighting Prussia, or allow the Prussians to do it for you if you're fighting the French. Britain is in a whole new territory when it comes to World War I. This paradigm of warfare will no longer work.
Recognizing their weakness, the British sounded the call for a new army, one that was to be unlike any other Britain had ever known. It was made up largely of volunteers.
The notion was that to increase recruitment, the British would allow men to sign up with their friends, and therefore the units became known as PALS battalions.
Almost every British small town had a PALS battalion. Men in similar jobs, men from the same row houses, men from the same streets, went down and signed up together under the promise of serving together, which was fantastic for morale.
There were units called the Post Office Rifles, who were all men who were from the same London Post Office branch.
You had the 23rd Royal Fusiliers, who called themselves the Sportsmen. These were men who had kicked footballs or waved tennis rackets or cricket bats before the war.
The soldiers who went off to war can't wait to get to the front, and their great anxiety is that it might be over before they get a chance to join in the fun. They went off to war not to sacrifice themselves so much as to have an adventure, to join in, and they embarked on this with great enthusiasm.
I can only say that I have never been so excited in my life. Like a boy going to play for the first time. That's how I felt.
In just 2 years, the British Army grew from just over 100,000 into a force of 1.5 million men.
Is that army a good one? No, it's poorly trained, it's poorly armed, it's poorly led. These men are going to have very difficult on-the-job training.
One of those put to the test was the recently appointed commander of the British Expeditionary Force, Sir Douglas Haig.
Haig's military background is a very typical British military background. Served in India, served in South Africa. He was an Edwardian military gentleman. An Edwardian military gentleman faced with the first modern total war. He has no experience like the experience that he's going to find at the Somme. He has no way to expect what's coming up.
For the Somme offensive, Haig hoped to compensate for his new army's lack of experience by bombing the Germans into submission.
One of the great criticisms of Haig is that his strategy was so traditional. It was essentially Napoleonic. That is, you soften up your enemy with an artillery bombardment, you pursue with infantry and cavalry, and that 100 years later he was using effectively that same system.
Keeping their promise to the French, the British rushed infantry to the Somme, and on June 24, 1916, implemented Haig's plan. The Battle of the Somme had begun. For 7 days, British artillery pounded the Germans.
What they hoped to do was win the battle predominantly through the largest artillery barrage that had ever been fired in the history of the world.
It was a rolling thunder of shell fire, and the earth vomited flame, and the sky was alight with bursting shells.
This artillery bombardment fired by these guns lasts for 7 days and fires 1.5 million artillery shells, which, just to stand back and think of it, must be staggering. Certainly the British soldiers watching it were thinking, how could anything survive this tumult?
And they hoped that that barrage would annihilate German forces and allow these inexperienced soldiers, quite literally, to walk through German lines unopposed.
But the British had greatly overestimated the potency of their barrage.
The British simply had too few guns and too few shells for the attack, and Haig exacerbated this problem by insisting that a very large number of targets were hit. So he in effect spread his fire too thinly. A second problem was that a lot of these shells weren't terribly reliable.
If an artillery piece fires 100 rounds, it will score 2 direct hits on a trench. One of those direct hits is almost certainly going to be a dud. So out of 100 shells fired at a German trench, 1 might be of value.
And the Germans had spent 2 years preparing themselves for an attack. Their vast system of trenches, tunnels, and bunkers was nearly impregnable. They'd protected the entire sophisticated web of dugouts with hidden machine gun batteries and dense concentrations of barbed wire.
Churchill called them undoubtedly the strongest military positions in the world. And he was probably right. There was a British journalist who walked over the battle afterwards and found one of these bunkers that had paneled walls and a piano inside of it. So the Germans knew this territory very, very well, had grown quite accustomed to it, and they knew how to defend it.
The Germans were very good at choosing where to dig in. As they fell back to the most easily defended places they could find. So the Germans had the advantage from the get-go.
After a week of pounding the Germans, and just minutes before their infantry was to attack, the British launched their coup de grace. Secretly, they had tunneled under the Germans' bunkers and had placed 10 powerful bombs beneath them. All of these mines were to be blown up in unison. But what had been intended as a surprise attack turned into an early warning for the other side.
One particular mine was blown under Hawthorne Redoubt. Unfortunately, this decision was made to blow the mine 10 minutes before the attack. And what it did was to compromise any chance of surprise on this part of the front, because when the mine went off, it gave the Germans 10 minutes warning that something big was about to happen.
The British couldn't have imagined that their bombardment had been unsuccessful. Instead, as they prepared their assault, their confidence and optimism remained unshaken.
The mood at the morning of July 1st was electric. These young men, 19, 20 years old, who volunteered to save their country, to save democracy, to defeat German militarism, this is their chance. You've witnessed 7 days of bombardment like none other, and their generals had told them there won't be any Germans surviving this bombardment. The world's greatest empire is finally going to fight as an empire. Of course they're going to win. When Britain finally invested all of its soul into a battle, of course they expected victory.
Well, Sergeant called out, 5 minutes to go, and every man ready, joking and smoking. 3 minutes to go, still they smoke and joke. And now, over you go, lads.
Wave after wave of the Allied infantry climbed out of their trenches along the entire 18-mile stretch of the front at the Somme. Their first task was to cross no man's land, the stretch of barren terrain up to half a mile across that separated them from the Germans. The young British soldiers approached what they believed was a German army ready for surrender. And the German machine gunners could hardly believe their eyes.
Even though it must have been horrifying to survive 1 week of this artillery bombardment, enough Germans did that when the bombardment ended, the Germans could resight their machine guns and take aim at these slow-moving, inexperienced British soldiers.
And they let loose what was later called a German choir from hell.
Forward we stumbled into a mist that seemed to grow ever thicker. So great was the noise that our voices sounded like flutes in a vast orchestra of fiends.
Individual battalions were getting up, walking out into no man's land, and getting fired on from everything the Germans have. The most notable case of this is the case with the Newfoundland Regiment. They had learned that the German frontline trench had not fallen, but they were still ordered into battle. They crossed no man's land, getting mown down along the way. In about the space of 40 minutes, this unit suffered 91% casualties. It was a 700-plus man unit. It lost 26 of its officers and over 650 of its men. Just decimated in the blink of an eye.
The very few Newfoundlanders who made it across no man's land discovered that the Germans' barbed wire remained virtually intact. And as they attempted to make their way through it, the Germans gunned them down. As night finally fell and the roar of the German machine guns stopped, quiet returned to the Somme. But that quiet was short-lived, as the tens of thousands who lay injured or dying cried out for help.
I remember reading a quote from someone who said, from the 1st of July 1916, all my faith in God died.
I don't think we can underplay the horror of the fighting on the Somme. It was a battle in which you stood a very high chance indeed of being killed or wounded if you were a frontline infantryman. Even if your body survived intact, it was quite possible that you would be psychologically scarred.
What you have are thousands of wounded in no man's land. And if you receive the proper kind of wound where you don't bleed to death, but you starve to death, you can remain in no man's land screaming for 7 or 8 days, usually screaming for help. And of course, if you're in a PALS battalion, this is one of your best friends that you've known for years out there screaming. And there's one word that each side learns in the other side's language, and that word is mother. Because that is who a 19-year-old kid who knows he's dying for the 4th day is going to scream. He's going to be screaming for his mother. And eventually, over time, this gets to both sides. The fact that there is this pitiful moaning and wailing coming up from no man's land.
It would take days before the unimaginable scale of the tragedy of July 1st became clear. More British soldiers died that day than on any other during World War I, or on any other day in the history of British warfare. And despite their sacrifice, very little French soil had been reclaimed from the Germans. When news from the first days of the battle reached England, and the enormity of the catastrophe sank in, the nation was consumed by grief.
It wasn't until really the lists of casualties were published in local newspapers that people began to be aware of the sheer scale of the fighting, and in particular the scale of the casualties.
The response to the Battle of the Somme is a bit of disbelief. How can we have lost so many of our young men, and for seemingly so little? Great mourning, great catharsis. Britain is devastated by this battle. It localizes slaughter. Some towns come through the Somme virtually unscathed. Other towns have their entire male population wiped out.
Back in the town that these guys had come from, there's, where are they, Ollie? It's a very palpable reminder of the real human cost of the war.
For the first time, film cameras documented the reality of war. In early August, to boost morale and build national pride, the British War Office released a silent film depicting the Battle of the Somme.
The ironic thing is that the British Army thought it was producing a rather sanitized version of what had happened on the Somme, because it didn't show a lot of artillery casualties, and it didn't show the really horrific things that were going on. But even the sanitized version shocked a lot of the British public.
But for all that, that did not cause an immediate reaction against the war. It did not lead to instant demands that peace must be made at any price. Far from it. If anything, I think it helped to stiffen resolve on the home front. Having sacrificed so much, people tended to believe that they should not give up fighting until they had achieved the victory that they were seeking.
And so, the Battle of the Somme wore on. Trench by trench, day after day, week after week. For the next 5 months, British troops pressed on.
On most days in the Somme, you're trying to remain sane in an insane world. There are these great gouts of cataclysmic battle in which unimaginable numbers of your friends die. And the soldiers that were cut down and died often were left there for the next 4+ months to decompose. You're fighting in an open graveyard. You dig your trenches through them, you live on them, you drink water out of shell holes that have corpses in them. In a very meaningful sense, a soldier's life at the Somme, especially at its worst times, can be seen as living in hell.
I never saw a body buried in 10 days. We had neither time nor space for burials, and the wounded could not be got away. They stayed with us and died, pitifully, and then they rotted.
You get to this weird thing where war comes to seem the normal condition of existence. By the end